Welcome to the debate. You can meticulously control variables in a lab. If you are building an economic model, you adjust the inputs, you measure the outputs, and you map the causal relationships. It is very clean.
Oh, totally.
But, the moment you try to apply behavioral science in your living room, say with a toddler who absolutely refuses to put their shoes on while you are 10 minutes late for work, all those neat theories just go right out the window.
They do. They really do.
Suddenly, that controlled laboratory becomes, arguably the most chaotic, high-stakes environment on Earth, which is the parent-child relationship.
Absolutely. It is a highly volatile ecosystem. You are dealing with developing neurobiology, entrenched generational patterns, and just real-time stress all colliding right there in the hallway.
Right in the hallway, exactly.
It's a fascinating space for social scientists to study because, well, the stakes are just so incredibly high.
Exactly. And today we are analyzing a comprehensive piece of social science literature that examines this very ecosystem. The material is a targeted analysis of the most common, deeply impactful mistakes parents make, along with concrete frameworks for correcting them.
Right, the real practical stuff.
Yeah. But as we dug into this research, a profound intellectual disagreement emerged between the two of us regarding how to actually interpret the underlying data. When we look at these harmful parenting behaviors, what is the primary mechanism that dictates a child's healthy development?
Right, what is the fundamental lever we are actually pulling when we try to raise a human being?
Are we trying to protect their feelings, or are we trying to build their competence?
Are we curating an environment, or are we, forging a set of life skills?
Precisely. Now, my reading of this text points to one undeniable foundation, which is emotional safety and self-worth. When you look at the most damaging mistakes outlined in our source material, like comparing siblings or using personal insults, they are universally attacks on the child's internal identity.
Okay, but
Just to finish my thought, from my perspective, the primary mechanism of healthy development is emotional security. If a child feels safe, the behaviors will follow. But I know you read the exact same data and walked away with a completely different foundational premise.
I did. I come at it from a different way. While I certainly do not dismiss the reality of a child's emotions, my position is that the text reveals behavioral autonomy and resilience as the true core of healthy development.
Behavioral autonomy.
Yes. Because when we look at the absolute worst things a parent can do according to this material, they are actions that either stifle a child's independence or destroy normal, functional communication. Fostering a capable, resilient human being who can navigate a difficult world is the primary mechanism of development, not merely curating a perfectly safe emotional state.
Well, let's really unpack that because I think we need to look closely at what the material identifies as the ultimate metric of successful parenting. To me, it is emotional memory.
Emotional memory?
Yes. The text concludes with a defining principle. Quote, "Your child may forget your words, but they will never forget how you made them feel." Now, that isn't just poetic phrasing. That is a profound statement about the neurobiology of memory.
It's a nice sentiment, sure.
It's more than a sentiment. Emotional impact outlasts cognitive recall. Think about the habit of comparing children. When a parent says, why can't you be like your brother? The consequences the text cites aren't just about the kid throwing a tantrum.
Right.
It cites low self-esteem, intense jealousy, and a chronic feeling of being never good enough.
But notice that you're focusing entirely on the internal state.
Yes, because the internal state dictates the external reality. If your fundamental worth is tethered to someone else's performance, you don't actually own your successes or your failures.
Well, parental approval just becomes a zero-sum game.
And we see the same thing when parents dismiss a child's feelings, saying something like, "Stop crying, it's nothing."
Which happens all the time.
Right. And the text states this causes the child to hide their emotions, feel emotionally unsafe, and face real difficulty expressing feelings later in life. It is the filter through which they make sense of reality.
I hear you, but
If you tell a child their sadness or frustration isn't real, they stop trusting their own brain. If the primary objective of parenting isn't establishing that baseline of emotional safety, the child is left constantly defending a fractured sense of self-worth.
Okay, but I come at it from a different way. Prioritizing emotional comfort over practical, autonomous development actually misreads the central warnings of this text.
Let's look at what happens when parents go too far in the direction you are advocating.
I wouldn't call it going too far. Well, the material provides a massive reality check about overprotecting children. What happens when a parent over-indexes on keeping a child emotionally and physically comfortable?
They feel supported.
No, the text explicitly warns that this creates a weak personality, a deep fear of failure, and a chronic dependence on others.
But those are the results of smothering a child, not validating them. I mean, I am talking about validation.
But let's be real, in practice, the line between validation and overprotection is incredibly thin, and look at the prescribed solutions in the text. The better way to handle an overprotected child isn't to sit them down for a deep emotional conversation. It is entirely action-oriented.
Is it?
Yes. The text says, allow the child to try, fail, and learn. It is pointing us toward a behavioral objective. The goal of the relationship isn't to shield the child from negative feelings like frustration or disappointment.
I'm not saying we shield them from everything.
But it sounds like it. The goal is to equip them to navigate a world that is inherently difficult and indifferent to their feelings. If we elevate emotional safety to the absolute highest priority, parents become terrified of letting their kids struggle. Fostering resilient behavior is the true objective here.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective, particularly when we look at the severity of verbal discipline in this material. You focus heavily on behavior, on raising an autonomous actor.
Because that's what matters in the real world.
But let's look at the damage caused by personal insults. The text gives brutal examples of things parents say in moments of anger, like, "You are stupid," or "You will never succeed."
Yeah, those are rough.
The consequences listed are devastating. It damages self-confidence. The child actually believes the negative labels, and it creates emotional wounds lasting for years.
It is undoubtedly damaging. I do not disagree with that at all.
But think about the mechanism of that damage. Let me offer an analogy. Think of a child's baseline identity as an operating system on a computer, and their specific behaviors are the software programs running on it.
Oh boy, here we go with the tech metaphors.
No, listen, it works perfectly. If a parent calls a child stupid, they aren't just criticizing a specific program. They are coding a virus directly into the operating system.
Okay, that's a bit dramatic.
It is accurate. The child incorporates stupid into their foundational identity. Every future software application, every attempt at schoolwork, every social interaction, it is all going to crash because the underlying system is corrupted.
Right, but
How can you argue that behavioral resilience is the primary goal when a child's underlying identity can be entirely dismantled by these insults? The behavioral failure is just a symptom. The destroyed identity is the actual disease.
I am sorry, but I just do not buy that. Let me tell you why. Your operating system analogy is clever, but you are treating the insult as a purely emotional transaction, whereas the text treats it as a failure of behavioral correction.
How is calling a kid stupid a behavioral correction?
Look at the proposed solution for insulting a child. It does not say, rebuild their self-esteem with daily affirmations. It says, correct the behavior, not the child's identity. Is still fundamentally to correct a behavior. The mistake wasn't that the parent intervened to discipline the child. The mistake was the method they used to do it.
They attacked the self.
They lost sight of the behavioral goal and lashed out. And we see this exact same dynamic when the text discusses constant yelling. You argue that emotional wounds are the deepest scars, but the text outlines a very different, deeply behavioral consequence of yelling.
Which is what?
It notes that yelling makes the child aggressive and causes them to stop listening to normal communication.
Well, yes, because the child is terrified. The text specifically notes that yelling creates fear and anxiety.
It does. But let's dig into the neuroscience of what is actually happening there, because it supports the behavioral framework. Let's go back to that scenario of being late for work and the kid refusing to put on their shoes.
Okay, the classic living room disaster.
Right. You yell. What happens physiologically? The child's cortisol spikes, their amygdala, which is the brain's threat detection center, fires up, and they enter a fight or flight response.
True.
The text says they become aggressive. But more importantly, the language processing centers of the brain effectively shut down.
The prefrontal cortex goes offline.
Exactly. So the fundamental issue with yelling isn't just that it hurts the child's feelings. It is that it completely destroys the signal-to-noise ratio.
The signal-to-noise ratio.
Yes, you have severed the functional communication channel. The child literally cannot process the instruction, "put on your shoes." The parent has lost their ability to guide the child's development.
But that's exactly why.
That is why the text solution is to speak calmly but firmly. It is an instrumental solution. You stay calm not to coddle the child, but to maintain your authority and ensure your behavioral instruction is actually received and processed. The entire framework of these corrections is about restoring the parent's ability to effectively guide behavior.
That is an interesting point, though I would frame the neuroscience completely differently.
How so?
You are looking at speak calmly but firmly as a mere tactic for compliance, a hack to get the shoes on.
I wouldn't call it a hack.
I argue that speaking calmly is what preserves the emotional safety required for the child's prefrontal cortex to remain online in the first place. You cannot have cognitive uptake in a state of neurological panic. And this brings us to a crucial tension in the text, which is the balance between protecting a child's internal world and pushing them to grow.
Oh, it is the central tension of all developmental psychology.
Exactly. Let's look at the scenario of dismissing a child's emotions. When a child is upset over something seemingly trivial, and the parent says, "Stop crying, it's nothing,"
Yeah.
the child learns to hide their emotions and feels fundamentally unsafe. The text says the better way is to listen and validate their emotions. You cannot separate a child's ability to act resiliently in the world from their ability to process their own internal reality.
Okay, but
If a child's internal world is constantly deemed nothing by the person they trust most, they lose the ability to accurately gauge reality. Emotional validation isn't about telling them they are right to cry over a broken cookie. It is acknowledging that their feeling of sadness is real.
right, sure.
That validation is the prerequisite foundation. Without it, how can they ever develop the resiliency you are talking about?
That is a compelling argument, but have you considered the logical extreme of what you are suggesting?
What logical extreme?
If we operate purely on the premise that validating emotions and maintaining emotional safety is the highest good, we walk directly into the trap of overprotection.
I do not think validation naturally leads to overprotection. I mean, they are two different mechanisms entirely.
In theory, sure, but in the messy reality of the living room, parents who over-index on making sure their child never feels emotionally distressed end up insulating them from the very friction required for growth.
Not if they are just validating the distress.
Think of a parent's role somewhat like a physical therapist. If a physical therapist stops a session the moment the patient feels discomfort, the muscle will never heal, and the patient will never walk properly again. It requires temporary discomfort to build lasting strength.
But a physical therapist doesn't insult you while you are doing the exercises. They don't scream at you.
True, but they do push you past your comfort zone. Look at the text's consequences for overprotection. It literally lists fear of failure.
Right.
Why does a child develop a fear of failure? Because the parent has swooped in to save them from every frustrating math problem or playground dispute. The parent isn't just saving them from frustration. They are implicitly telling the child, "You are not capable of handling this." They have been kept emotionally safe at the direct expense of their developmental competence. If a parent is constantly hovering, making sure the child never feels inadequate, they are robbing that child of the necessary process of adaptation. That is why the text demands we allow the child to try, fail, and learn. Growth requires the friction of reality.
I am just not convinced by that line of reasoning because you are creating a false dichotomy between emotional safety and risk. You are suggesting that emotional safety means a lack of friction.
Well, it often does in practice.
I argue, based on this text, that emotional safety is the only thing that allows a child to safely experience that friction without being destroyed by it.
How so? Walk me through the mechanics of that.
Let's link the danger of overprotection back to the danger of comparing siblings. You want the child to try, fail, and learn. That is your ultimate metric for resilience.
Yes.
But how does a child process a failure? Let's say they fail a spelling test. If a parent has a history of comparing the child to their older sister, making them feel like they are never good enough, then failing that test is catastrophic. It is absolute proof of their inherent inferiority. It confirms the virus in the operating system, to use my earlier metaphor.
Because their baseline is tied to someone else?
Precisely. But look at the tax solution for the comparison mistake. Compare the child to their own progress, not others. Establishing an individualized baseline creates an emotionally safe container.
A container.
Yes, it tells a child your worth is not dependent on beating your sister. You are safe here. Only within that emotionally safe container can the child actually execute your goal of trying, failing, and learning.
I see what you're saying.
If they fail, it is just a data point in their own progress, not a devastating blow to their identity. Therefore, the emotional safety I am championing is not the opposite of resilience. It is the fundamental prerequisite for the resilience you are championing.
I understand the synthesis you are attempting there. It is an elegant way to tie those concepts together, but I still maintain the primary orientation of the text leans heavily toward the pragmatic over the purely emotional.
Of course you do.
Well, I think the clearest evidence for this is how the material concludes, where it attempts to define the ideal parent.
You mean the concluding summary?
Yes, the text explicitly states a child does not need perfect parents. I find that to be a profoundly pragmatic, liberating statement.
It is liberating, yes.
It acknowledges the chaotic laboratory we talked about at the beginning of the show. It gives parents permission to be human, to make mistakes, to occasionally lose their temper, or to misjudge a situation.
Within reason.
Right, but it supports the idea that parents should focus on the messy, practical work of raising a capable human being, engaging in that relentless cycle of trying, failing, and correcting behavior rather than paralyzing themselves with the anxiety of maintaining perfectly curated emotional exchanges at all times. The rejection of perfect parents is a rejection of the fragile, overly sensitive parenting model that obsesses over every micro-emotion.
I see exactly what you were doing, but you are deliberately truncating the data to fit your framework.
Am I?
You cannot analyze the first half of that quote without the immediate necessary condition that follows it. A child does not need perfect parents. Yes, absolutely. We all agree on that. But what is the second half of that exact sentence?
Well,
they need understanding and emotionally safe parents.
The text does use those exact words. I will grant you that.
It literally uses the phrase emotionally safe as the ultimate concluding requirement of the entire analysis. The author takes us through the neurological damage of yelling, the identity destruction of insults, the paralysis of comparison, and arrives at a definitive thesis.
Right.
Perfection is impossible, but the non-negotiable baseline, the thing that covers a multitude of parenting sins, is emotional safety. The author didn't say a child does not need perfect parents. They need parents who enforce behavioral autonomy. They explicitly centralized emotional safety as the paramount duty.
It is a strong concluding line. I won't deny that, but I would argue that understanding and emotionally safe in the context of the entire document means something very specific.
Which is?
It means a parent who understands the child's developmental need to try, fail, and learn. An emotionally safe parent, according to the actual behavioral corrections in the text, is one who speaks calmly but firmly.
Yes, exactly.
But one who corrects the behavior rather than the identity. It is a safety derived from consistent, reliable boundaries and guidance, not just emotional coddling. To use my physical therapist analogy again, it is the safety of knowing the person pushing you to your limits actually knows what they are doing.
Well, this has been a deeply illuminating exchange. The friction between these two perspectives really highlights the complexity of the material. I think it is time we summarize our respective stances.
Sounds good.
Wounds of being called stupid, the toxic jealousy born of sibling comparison, the inability to express feelings caused by emotional dismissal, it demonstrates a clear pattern.
Right.
The internal world of a developing child is deeply impressionable. Therefore, protecting a child's internal self-worth and creating a container of emotional safety is the foundational duty of the parent-child relationship. Without that safe operating system, no healthy behavior can truly take root.
And while I acknowledge the very real dangers of inflicting emotional wounds, my stance remains anchored in the text's focus on practical outcomes. The explicit warnings against overprotection, the fear of failure it generates, and the constant refrain to correct the behavior prove a different thesis.
The practical guide. Yes, the parent is not a therapist. They are a guide. The true core of the parent-child dynamic is navigating the friction of reality to guide a child toward an autonomous, resilient adulthood. You cannot achieve that if you are paralyzed by the fear of causing temporary emotional discomfort. You have to let them struggle to let them grow.
It is a profound tension, but I think where we absolutely converge today is on the destructive nature of the specific behaviors outlined in the text.
Oh, absolutely.
Whether you view the living room through the lens of identity preservation or through the lens of functional communication, constant yelling, sibling comparison, and personal insults are universally destructive. They fail on both of our metrics.
Entirely agreed. Whether you are trying to protect the child's self-esteem or you are simply trying to get them to listen so you can get out the door on time, calling them stupid or screaming at them completely sabotages the objective.
Completely.
It triggers a neurological panic that makes learning impossible. It is fascinating how these dual perspectives, the emotional and the behavioral, ultimately diagnose the exact same actions as catastrophic failures. It shows how valuable it is to study these frameworks simultaneously rather than in isolation.
There is undoubtedly so much more to explore in the psychology of family dynamics, and the material provided, we leave it to our listeners to evaluate the evidence, look at their own experiences, and decide which developmental framework they find more compelling in interpreting these critical interactions.
Exactly.
But as we close, I keep returning to our initial image of the laboratory versus the living room. We can debate the variables. The inputs of emotional validation versus the inputs of behavioral autonomy.
Yeah.
But the raw data remains the same. When the experiment is over and the child leaves the controlled environment of the home, they take the results of that experiment with them out into the real world. And as the text reminds us, while they may forget the exact methodology you used, they will never forget how you made them feel.